Economic Development Association. And then we also have Colleen Bond, who will be doing. I'll let her introduce herself in a second. We'll just go through and introduce you to who the BC Economic Development Association is first. We're the leading association of economic developers in British Columbia, both from local governments, regional governments, Indigenous governments, provincial. We have about close to 500 members throughout the province, large and small. Our largest segment of our membership is actually the smaller sized communities, and but of course that's the makeup of British Columbia as well. So we host a lot of different events. We hold our annual summits, which like Can Do will be virtual in 2021. We host courses. A number of you may have attended some of our courses. We do an annual course in the fall, which this year we're working on being able to turn our 4-day course into a virtual conference or a virtual training course over a period of 3 months. So there'll be details coming out on that. And then we have a variety of different resources available on our website, and it's www.bcda.ca, and you can access 99% of the resources on there, whether you're a member or a non-member. It doesn't matter. We believe that when you see value, you'll join. So we're not all about pushing the membership. So Colleen, you want to talk about us? Maybe I should just say that I've worked in small and large communities in economic development. So I ran the Economic Development Organization in Lillooet, British Columbia for a number of years, and then moved to Chilliwack in 2000. So was involved with economic development for about 17, 18 years, when in 2007 went on my own and took over the Economic Development Association of BC, and then a partnership also with Colleen Bond for consulting. So Colleen, I'll let you talk about you and the consulting.
Okay, thanks, Dale. Yeah, as Dale said, we are partners in EDCD Consulting. We focus on economic development, community development type strategies and initiatives. We just started in our 13th year of doing that, so I can't believe we've been doing that long. Dale, I don't know about you, but we've had a lot of fun along the ways, and hopefully I think we've had a lot of successes and helped a lot of communities. We do focus on those smaller rural communities. That's sort of more of our passion, and interest, is helping those communities along. We've done work throughout particularly Western Canada, as well as internationally. We've just been doing some training work in places like Cambodia and the Mariana Islands. We've been into Alaska, Virgin Islands, that sort of thing. So places that, again, 13 years ago, I don't think either of us thought this venture would take us. Between us, yeah, we do have 50 years. Dale is probably about 40 of those years. And there's just some of the things that we have put together for different, and just a small sampling of things that we worked for some communities. But I would say, almost regretfully, in the last 5 years, more and more of our work is surrounding that recovery and resiliency piece. Not the resiliency piece. I'm really happy that we can help communities pre-plan for disasters, but unfortunately a lot of our work is coming after the disasters and helping communities get back.
Colleen, you mentioned about the 14 years and where we've been and some of the places, and I still think of when the US folks asked us if we would go to the Mariana Islands last fall, and I think both of us went, where the heck are the Mariana Islands? And it's like, Google. Yeah, so it was like Google. Thank goodness for Google, because we didn't have to embarrass ourselves too much. But and for those of you who don't know where the Mariana Islands are, it's over near the Philippines. So, but it's a U.S. territory. So we'll continue on here, and I see, you're watching the news in the last couple of days, and we're hearing a lot about the wildfires. And Colleen, you said that at the very beginning, how you know, unfortunately, we're going in and we're helping communities on the recovery piece and not so much on the resiliency. And although we have been trying to encourage all levels of government, you know, be it you know, from Indigenous to local to regional to provincial. And I can't really say we've really talked that much to the federal about it, but we truly believe that that communities are not prepared to how do you react in the event of a disaster that will strike your community. And we say every time that when a disaster strikes, okay, now we're going to be ready next time. We've learned our lesson. And then the next time comes, okay, now we're going to be ready the next time because we've learned our lesson. And unfortunately, and it's not a criticism as much as it's just, you know, I think for us, we really believe we would just as soon come into a community before a disaster and talk about how to prepare for a disaster. You know, we've got, you know, as you'll see in the next slide after this one, that, you know, a lot of experience in disaster recovery and preparing communities for disaster. And whether it's us or whoever it is that's coming in, it needs to happen. And we need to recognize, and we hopefully throughout this day or throughout this hour, we'll talk about, you know, how you can prepare. A little bit of a cautionary note is that, and I'm talking too much obviously already, but we've taken a full day session and tried to turn it into an hour. So you can imagine that it's, you know, these are full day sessions that we do in communities. So with the disaster, the Economic Development Association started the Economic Disaster Recovery Program, and it's actually the Economic Disaster Resiliency and Recovery Program now. And it was originally established in 2012 in response to the Burns Lake mill explosion. We offered to the province to send a team of economic development professionals up to Burns Lake and to help them and the Bean First Nations and help them put together a bit of a recovery plan for the community and to enable them to move forward. Most of the recommendations were accepted, and we're happy to see that. We have volunteers from across North America, not just British Columbia, but from across North America that will come in. As a matter of fact, one of the projects we did in British Columbia in 2018, we had, you know, representatives from Washington State. In 2013, we had representatives from Florida. So we had, you know, we do have volunteers from all over the place that have put forward their names. We can go to communities when asked, but we only go when asked. We don't force ourselves on communities. So we have very limited resources. So when we are asked, we do ask that expenses and that are covered, and we're hoping generally that the province or the federal government is paying for that. And then we do partner with the International Economic Development Council. Some of the projects, again, Burns Lake and the Southern Alberta flooding, we did recovery plans for 11 different communities, 10 local governments, and 1 Indigenous community. We worked with, we helped develop the U.S. Economic Recovery Framework back in 2013 as well, and going out to Washington, D.C. We were involved in the wildfires in 2017 and 2018. We were in the Virgin Islands. We were responding after Hurricane Irma and Maria at the request of the U.S. We've done a bunch of plans in Saskatchewan. I'll get Colleen to talk about that. But basically, we've done a lot of different work, as you see, and everyone's a little bit different in what the needs are when we go into the communities. Colleen, you want to talk about Saskatchewan? Or?
Yeah, just really briefly, I wanted to just touch on Saskatchewan because, you know, as we were just talking about, both Dale and myself, you know, we come into the communities after the disasters has already happened versus pre-disaster to get communities ready. And what had happened in Saskatchewan was 2 different projects, actually. The first was the province of Saskatchewan themselves and the Economic Development Association brought us in and brought communities within their province for us to give them, it was actually a 2-day session, I believe, there, to put together resiliency and recovery plan. So that was, before any disaster was going to happen, let's get that plan in place. And that we were really happy to do. And we've done it with a few communities one-on-one, but I really thought that I was really progressive of the Saskatchewan provincial government to do it and get all of their communities involved. So really like that one. And the other one is we went into Saskatchewan, Manitoba, actually, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Flin Flon, because they had given, they were given notice last year that their major employer, it's a mine, was going to be closing in 3 years. So we were brought in again to start to put together that plan prior to the closure of what they could do so that when that closure did happen in 3 years' time, they would be more resilient as a community. So those are the types of projects that I think communities need to look at more versus being reactive and being proactive.
Right, and Colleen, I think now you mentioned like the Flin Flon one. I mean, we were working there with 2 provinces, 3 local governments, and then the one in Indigenous community, the Peter Valentine First Nations.
Yeah.
And it is going to impact all of those communities. If you know the area at all, it's a pretty big hit, but at least they're preparing ahead of time for what that impact could be and hoping to make sure that some of those impacts aren't as bad as what they would be if the mine had just closed its doors today.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what is a disaster. And a disaster is a lot of different things. It can be things like agriculture diseases, windstorms, wildfires. We've all seen a lot of the wildfires over the last number of years. Unfortunately, it looks like it's coming back. Right now, just watching the news, it's been very dry for the last couple of weeks. So fortunately, it's been a bit later of a start this year than what it has been in the last couple. But given the fact that COVID going on, it's a good thing. Tornadoes and hurricanes, and then of course other. And the argument that we talked to U.S. people here a couple of weeks ago, and the question was where do pandemics come into it? And really, we don't know at this particular point. We don't know how it started. We don't know everything. So is it a natural type of disaster? Is it a man-made? Could it have been avoided? I have no idea. And so it's hard for us to talk about what that is, but it's either a natural type or man-made, and man-mades are those hazardous materials, cyber attack, explosions, terrorism, plant closures, as Colleen was talking about with Flin Flon. These are your typical types of disasters, but then sometimes we don't necessarily think about what is the unthinkable. And a couple of the items on that last slide that talked about terrorism, for an example, the picture on the left-hand side is actually in downtown Toronto. And we were out talking to the folks in the city of Toronto about a year after this event happened, and where it was a van, a terrorist got in a van and then drove up onto the sidewalk and ran over a bunch of people, and it was proven to be a terrorist attack. And unfortunately, what happens in that downtown core is the police investigation happens, that the area is closed for when it happens, obviously, but then afterwards, the police investigation and everything gets closed off while they do their work. And so those businesses are losing money, losing customers throughout that whole time. That's impacting that economy, the economy for that area of downtown Toronto. And it not only impacts it for the immediate time of when that disaster happened, but it also impacts it sort of on the long term, as people are concerned do we want to go there? Are we safe to go to that part of town? So you always get questions around those types of things. So we need to plan as to how do we bring people back. And it's no difference whether it's a small little area like the downtown street in Toronto, or a big area like like northern BC or the Caribou or somewhere like that. How do we get people back visiting these areas to make sure that the economy recovers? Then in the section on the right hand side is a car driving through a Tim Hortons window, closing an area of a little shopping plaza while they deal with this, and the damage that it caused, and the loss of employment for the workers, and again, how do we work with those businesses to overcome some of those negative impacts? And then, of course, the real unexpected hits, and that's that pandemic. And the pandemic has had huge impacts. I don't think really need to say that. Obviously, in every one of our communities, and in one format or another, the health of our people is an impact. The economy is an impact. Our ability to even communicate and to be with each other, that social aspect that is so important in our day-to-day lives. It's so different than any disaster that I think any of us have ever dealt with. Colleen?
Yeah, these will just go through fairly quickly. These are some of the economic impacts, and these are for Canada as a whole. So you can see that the GDP is projected to fall by 7.8% for this year. It will rise just over 5% next year, 2021. But it really, is not going to reach those pre-pandemic levels until early 2022. So we've got 2 years ahead of us here. The Bank of Canada, it's forecast that Canada's economic activity isn't going to return to that pre-pandemic level until 2022. But they have said, which is never been done before, said that their interest rates are going to be kept low for at least 2 years, and we've never had that type of forecasting before from the Bank of Canada, for sure. Unemployment is at just over 12% there. A good sign, though, was in June there was almost 1 million jobs was put on or were hired back. Now, most of those jobs were really in the service sector, those part-time jobs, the maybe lower wage jobs. Those were predominantly what were hired back in June, and really that reflects what happened as soon as the pandemic hit. Those were the jobs that were lost right off the bat. So they're seeing some of those jobs coming back now. So and as I said, that is good news to see those numbers in June. But employment, we're still down almost 2 million jobs since the pandemic started. So those are sort of that number in January, February, early March sort of thing. So it's going to take quite a while, as we know, to get to those pre-pandemic levels. Consumer confidence is up. So the Conference Board of Canada, they measure consumer confidence on a monthly basis, and they showed that in June, confidence was roughly up about 2/3 of the level of pre-pandemic. And BC showed the largest, while Ontario the smallest. Retail sales, that certainly boomed back from between April and May, and of course reflective of the stores being opened, some of the restaurants being opened, even if it was half capacity. So we saw, an 18% in that month, April to May. But there's still overall retail sales are down 20% from, say, again, January, February, early March. There's some numbers of some of those increases. Again, probably likely no surprise, sporting goods, hobbies, that was 100%. Clothing, people needed to stay home, so that's certainly why those sporting goods and hobbies were up. Gas, as we started to venture out a little further from home, went up. The only ones actually that didn't increase is grocery stores. They were only down, I think, about 2%, so not a huge decrease. But they did decrease, and again, because they had that huge influx of people shopping, whether it was online or that once a week grocery shop that you could get, that hoarding of toilet paper and everything else that made their sale increase go crazy. Again, no surprise, look at that increase in online sales. That's 100% plus, and that's a year-to-year measurement. So that's May 20 from May 2019. And then the next slide here that we'll look at is looking at the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Businesses, and they look to say that there's about 50,000 Indigenous businesses in Canada, and according to their research, that is about $31 billion that's contributed to Canada's GDP. And their research shows that if there's more support for Indigenous businesses and the communities as a whole, that number could easily triple to, you know, close to 100 million or 100 billion, if not more. But there needs to be that improvement to procurement for the Indigenous communities and businesses, more investment into them, those different opportunities that will do there. They also did a survey of their businesses, of some Indigenous businesses here. And these are pretty bleak numbers, as you can see. So almost 80%. So had a decrease of 30% or more in their revenues. And of those, over 50% or 75%. And look at that, you know, a third, well over a third had no sales at all, no sales. So that's really kind of depressing numbers, really. And then when we look at Indigenous businesses, there's a large number that are direct tourism related. So they're your direct operators, and that's 3 out of 5. So a third of your businesses are tourism related, are not tourism related, they're direct tourism. So that's not even including your restaurants and your retail and all of those businesses that have indirect tourism impact. So it's really significant. And here in BC, what we found is a lot of the Indigenous communities here have closed down since COVID. They don't want people into their community for health reasons and everything that comes with that. So they're closed down. So we've got a quick video of what they're going to do, and we'll talk about sort of how that relates as well.
We believe everything depends on everything else. Everything is connected. Our actions today are guided by our natural and supernatural laws. Our ancestors who have gone before us, and by our neighbors and communities. Right now, it's time to heal. And as we begin to emerge, our spirit to be stronger than before. We will welcome everyone with open arms. For now, we'll pause and take care of our lands. Take care of our communities. Take care of one another, so we can see each other again soon.
Want anything to that, Colleen? Or?
Yeah, I think that's a great video. That's from the Indigenous Tourism BC Association. And there's lots of reasons to love that video, but with regards to disaster, post and pre-disaster sort of thing, what it's saying is, you know what, our communities are not ready for you. And we have recognized that. And when we are ready for you, we will welcome you back in. And that's a huge part of what we need to talk about when we talk about resiliency. And is your community ready for a disaster?
Yeah, and I think they've really set a good example in some cases where they are closing their communities. I just think about, you know, now the province is actually closed off, like Haida Gwaii and those types of things. I mean, we weren't ready to, or they aren't ready to accept people. You know, that does create a problem. And again, though, but how can we be ready to accept people the next time around? And if a different type of disaster strikes, be it fire, flood, whatever, that we are better prepared to. The other thing I liked about that video is it showed not only the tourism aspect and in many ways, I think, but it showed the economic aspect too, and, you know, the fishing. And even though that may be looked at as a way of life, it's also in some communities a part of an economy. And so we, you know, there's so many aspects to it that of the areas that are being impacted. The other thing that I think it's a shame in some ways is that this is a perfect opportunity where people are traveling our province, because we never I mean, the majority of British Columbians never travel within British Columbia. We travel abroad, or we travel to Washington State or elsewhere. And so these people are traveling their communities. And unfortunately, I mean, I think unfortunately they're not traveling safely in many ways. And we need to make sure that, and I do respect the fact that a number of the communities have closed off and said, please respect that. And I'm hoping that people are respecting that. And yes, we will send a copy of the link for the video when we send a copy of the presentation. So.
Yeah.
Oh, we won't watch it again though.
That was good though.
Yeah. Is your community ready? I think I can safely say that most communities in British Columbia that we know of are not ready for the disasters. As much as we have recovery plans, or as much as maybe not recovery plans, but emergency plans, we don't have the recovery plans in place. How do we rebuild that economy? And remembering that our presentation is really about the economy aspect of a disaster, the economic impacts. But we're not prepared enough as communities, whether it's Indigenous, local, regional, or even the province of British Columbia, is not really adequately prepared to address the impacts of any type of disaster, never mind COVID. It's any type of disaster. We are not as prepared as we should be. And I see a lot of the scrambling, and Colleen and I kind of shake our heads sometime, because we see a lot of the scrambling that's going on within the province to establish programs and federally to establish programs. Yet if we look back to recommendations put forward by not only our organization since 2012, but others in other parts of the country, we could have been better prepared to address some of the things in a more immediate manner. It's unfortunate, and like even some of the reports that have just come out by the Business Council, BC Business Council, and this is how do we rebuild the economy, and it's all focused on the big things. It's not focused on the little things. It's not focused on how do we help our communities overcome the economic challenges faced by COVID, by those disasters. How do you help those tourism businesses in your communities, come back next year after losing a full year's of revenue?
And typically research shows after a disaster, I think it's about 25%. So 1 in 4 businesses won't survive a disaster. That's typically what the research has shown, which is significant. Excuse me, especially in a smaller community. 1 in 4 businesses won't survive is very significant. But with this pandemic, research is showing, our forecasts, I guess, is showing up to 75% will not survive. Up to 3 in 4. We'll see how that really translates, as we get more into that recovery phase. But that's a pretty scary number. And I think,
you're right, Colleen. And I think that one of the things that maybe, that many businesses won't survive, and some of them may reopen initially. There's a concern is, are we going to end up having to close again? And I personally think we probably would have been better off to not open and instead of risking closing again. We don't want to be doing that. Because that creates more problems for those business owners. But then again, if they do reopen, will they be able to survive the impacts and the loss of business from that over that longer term? And so, while they might not show immediately that those businesses are going to close, but in the long term, will they survive? Mm-hmm. So let's talk about getting your community disaster ready. There's 4 phases of disaster. There's the mitigation phase, the preparedness mitigations, creating the fire berm around the community. It's creating, diking to protect yourself from flooding. And then there's that preparedness phase, making sure you have an adequate plan in place for if a disaster hits, how are that plan is laying out how you're going to respond. And what we find in those planning phases is that it's not including the things, even though all 4 of these are part of the mandate, that most of the plans are not including that recovery aspect. Where we talk in there about the recovery of the infrastructure, or the recovery maybe of, like the roads, the infrastructure, the offices, maybe homes or something like that. But we don't talk about the economy. We don't talk about the importance of making sure that the economy recovers from that disasters. And after we've done the preparation, we deal with the response. How do we get people out? How do we save lives? And then again, going to that recovery phase. So we need to do a better job of addressing that recovery phase.
Yeah, and part of that recovery certainly falls on the shoulders of the economic development practitioner in the community, and rightfully so. They're the ones who should be most connected to their community, their business community for sure. So all of the roles that you would traditionally play on a day-to-day basis, you know, the analyst, the catalyst, the gap filler, the advocate, all of those things that normally you were doing on your day-to-day basis just become even more so. But one of the most key roles that you can play as an economic development officer or practitioner in your community is that of communicator, and that's making sure you are talking with your businesses and where is you know, getting that level of feedback from them. What do they need to survive and get into their recovery mode? What can the local government do? So how are you able to really get everybody together and communicate really what is happening, particularly at that local level, but also provincially, also federally? What are those programs that can be useful to your businesses? All of that sort of thing. And you know what? This is an interesting one in the sense, Dale, if you remember when we did the seminar, the workshop in the province of Saskatchewan, one of the communities that was sitting around the table was Humboldt. And it was shortly after that unfortunate disaster there with the hockey team. And she came to us and said, you know, what is my role, right? And that wasn't your typical disaster. It didn't even actually happen within the community of Humboldt itself, if you will, right? It was on their way, it was a highway. So it's an interesting role that, you know, we need to think of these unthinkable things, like what is the role there? And that is not necessarily an economic role, and jump in when you want, Dale, but it's not necessarily an economic role, but it's certainly a communicator role. It's certainly an advocate. It's certainly that educator. And it's certainly a role that a lot of times we don't realize we need as EDOs when we are dealing post-disaster, is compassion and empathy, and how we need to hear the stories of these individuals or businesses that are affected.
And how they're impacted by any type of a disaster. I think that Humboldt story, and we probably don't tell that one often enough, where she, you know, was talking about that whole, and again, it was like a few short weeks after, but one of the things that she really said was that the business or the community wasn't prepared to manage the positive economic impacts that came as a result of it. And she was careful in how she said that because she didn't want to make it look like, oh, you know, we made money off this. Yeah. But it was, the businesses weren't, you know, capable of, you know, maybe meeting the needs of all of the people that were coming into the community, the families of those injured, the media, you know, their population probably doubled over that period of time, for a short period of time. But how do you manage that type of a thing? And she left the session that day. She said, "Man, I wish we'd have had this session, you know, 6 months ago." Yeah. And maybe they'd have been better prepared, and especially understanding that communication part of it. I want to point out quickly on the left-hand side, the photo is our board member, Trevor Coots from Hawaii First Nations. And they've done an incredible job of communicating with their community the need to, you know, we're closed, you know, now they're just starting to open their offices, but they're working closely with the city of Port Alberni, and it's that whole people needing to work together and the role that they're playing. And Trevor heads up their Economic Development Committee as a counselor for Hawaii First Nations. So. It's preparedness, understanding how your community will be impacted, but not just your community, but even the region. So how will that region be impacted? If you can work with others in this whole preparedness phase, it's really, really important. To train and to educate in how you're going to respond and how you're going to recover. You need to be engaging with the businesses that you have, whether they're band owned or whether they're nation owned, whether they're private sector owned on leased land. It doesn't matter. You need to be engaging with those businesses that are that are in your community. And those businesses need to be prepared, and we'll talk briefly about that. But pre-disaster strategic planning. So again, how do we make sure we have a strong economy in place, but also how do we recover from a disaster? Needs to be done right up front. And then of course, set up a recovery center. In many cases, in some of the smaller communities, maybe the recovery center incorporated with the overall recovery center. But in some cases where you have a large number of businesses, dedicate an area or dedicate a location where those business owners or managers can go to find the supports that they need, to get the assistance they need, and to really even talk amongst each other. That was something that we seen during the wildfires of 2017, is that businesses wanted a central location to go to. We set some locations up in Kamloops and Prince George where people could go and talk to other businesses, or to use computers, or to do things, so that these businesses were able to address their current situation in a private setting. And then of course, understanding provincial and federal resources, and we don't talk a lot about that today, but you really do need to understand those provincial and federal resources. In the recovery phase is that fourth phase. We need to remember it's going to take it could take a long time. So in a flood, for an example, Siksika First Nations in Alberta, 2013, they are still feeling the impacts in that community of the flood in 2013. They're not fully recovered. There's still residences living in temporary facilities and other things that we're not, it can take a long time, whether it's Siksika or whether it's Grand Forks, it doesn't matter. It takes a long time to recover from a disaster. And when you think of COVID, it's gonna be a long-term recovery. It's not going to happen by the end of the year. It's not going to happen even as soon as a vaccine is discovered. It's going to take many, many years to rebuild from the impacts of COVID-19. And we need to make sure that we're protecting our communities in the process to allow them to start up and to continue and to rebuild their economies.
Yeah, an easy example of that, Dale, I would say, is if you look at the international travel industry. So that's projected to take 4 years, and maybe even a little longer, but a good 4 years before that travel is going to come back into our communities. And that, of course, is tourism. And so many of our communities across Canada have such a tourism industry in their communities or in their region or in their province. That's a huge impact. That, again, recovery is 4 years for that.
And then, of course, there's that, the investment in economic development capacity. Maybe we're biased in a sense, but and I know, like, from an association standpoint, we truly believe that investment in economic development at your community level needs to be it's even more essential right now than it's ever been before. And it's not just about helping the business that maybe the nation owns, or it's not about helping or just supporting even that business that's there, but it's also supporting the workers that are living in your community that may be working off community and in a neighboring community, and how are we supporting them and doing workforce development programs and other things to ensure that their jobs are not impacted in the long term, and taking advantage of the time now to be training people and to providing levels of assistance that maybe we never had to before. Pre-disaster planning is a must. It's the small businesses, as we've talked about, those are the employers. There's always an assumption that government's going to help, and we've seen that in every community that we've ever been to. Whether it's a local government, a regional district, or whether it's even an indigenous community, when infrastructure or the businesses themselves, we either think insurance or we think the government's going to bail them out or to help them out financially. And I will say, with COVID, there is significant financial resources being put into helping businesses deal with the impacts, but that's not always the case. And as a matter of fact, I would say the largest percentage of time, there is no support. for businesses or very limited support. And we've seen businesses in some communities where you know, the less than 10% of the businesses actually qualify for any provincial or federal support. And so we need to make sure that we're also educating ourselves, but also educating our businesses that they need to make sure that the resources are in place to deal with an impact of a disaster themselves. There's so many multiple benefits for being prepared. So Colleen, do you want to cover off this slide just to talk about some of these items?
Yeah, so if you were to do, and I hope you are going to do, a recovery plan before the disaster happens, this is sort of what your plan would have in it. So you would do that community risk assessment. And as you're doing this plan, it's really important to know that this is not what you're going to do all on your own. You're not going to sit at your desk and write all this stuff out. You're going to gather your key stakeholders around the table and really get those inputs. So those people who are really involved in economic development, in community as a whole, get some of the, you know, the fire response, emergency response people. These are important people to have around your table as you build your plan. So you're going to do that community risk. What is the risk that you have? And some of them you'll know, and some of you won't. You would never have guessed COVID for one thing, right? You would never have guessed that. But you will know whether fire is a risk. You will know whether floods are a risk, all of that sort of thing. Then you really need to talk about how are you going to engage with your business community once the disaster hits. So you need to have a plan for that. What are your strategies for that? Having a business center for economic recovery. Dale mentioned that a few slides back. Having that one place where businesses can go to get the information that's reliable, that's up to date, you know, that's hopefully rumor free, but there needs to be a spot for that business center. And what's important to note too, you probably should have, you know, your first plan for your business center, your first location, maybe a second one, and maybe even a third one, because you don't know where that disaster is going to hit. And you know, you might put it down the middle of Main Street, and that's where the flood hit, right? So you need to have a different area to account for as well. How are you going to get businesses back into the community? And that's a really important part. And I know, Dale, you're going to talk about that in a little bit, and I think in an example. So I'll leave that one there. But it's really key to identify how your businesses will get back into the community. What are the business financing options that are available for businesses? How are you getting that out to your business community? How are you going to help them build capacity, whether it's for the business themselves, whether it's workforce planning, all of those sort of stuff. Their buildings, their land reuse, development, all those may be affected, maybe not, but if they are, you need to have a plan in place. Communications, as we talked about, the role of the EDO, one of the most key things you're going to do is communicate. So you need to have that strategy in place of who is that one person. It's really important to have one person be that communication lead. You're not going to do it alone, as I said, but one person is the lead. And how are you communicating out? What are all the different methods you're going to use, and what are you communicating? And then, as Dale said, what are those recovery programs available? Just make a really good idea of where those are, what they are, and how they can help your businesses.
Right. The other thing with the recovery center, Colleen, and that's something I hadn't mentioned, was of course, you know, the location, where, and making sure that, you know, you have a few locations selected. And it's not a bad idea to have a location selected in a neighboring community. It might be a partnership with another organization, or it might be like, you know, it's just making sure that there is a location for you, your people, your residents, your businesses to go to, whether it's in your community or in a neighboring community, it doesn't matter. Again, local community, the business community engagement. You know, we as, you know, you as an Indigenous government or local governments or provincial or federal governments who make emergency management decisions, and these all impact those businesses. So we need to engage with those businesses to make sure that they understand what may happen, what might happen if there's a disaster, and help them get themselves a plan in place to have a business continuity plan. You make sure, you know, because most businesses actually won't. Although I have seen some stories lately about some that actually have activated their business continuity plans, and I was looking at some information from the Siksika First Nations and looking at some of their businesses and how they have activated their continuity plans as a result of COVID. And I thought that's a really good example of, they've realized from the flooding that, as community and as businesses, we need to be better prepared if something was to happen. Going out and engaging with your businesses is, before, during a disaster and after disaster is so important. And make sure that it's done in a coordinated manner. And whatever you do, make sure your information is stored in some sort of a system so that it becomes a legacy piece, and that you're also able to run reports, do graphs, monitor the success. Don't just store it in Excel spreadsheets and have, hundreds of fields of information. Have it in a way that you can actually, use your CRM, whatever CRM you use. Make sure that you're using something that you can use to benefit your programs and to help your planning decisions in the future. Need to educate and inform these businesses, develop information sources before and following a disaster, and then circulate them to your businesses. And really, disaster recovery is business retention on steroids. It's the jobs, businesses create jobs, and the jobs, if the businesses aren't back, the jobs aren't back. And then the community has a hard time recovering from that. And so all businesses count, and it doesn't matter what type of business that you have, that is in your community, all those businesses count, and you need to figure out a way to make sure that you're working with them to get their businesses back up and running. So you need to be at a minimum doing business retention. You need to collect comprehensive contact information. We have seen this. And unfortunately, I remember meeting with Siksika First Nation. I hate to use them as an example, but they've done good things and bad things. But when the flooding happened and it wiped out the entire community, for the most part, everything was underwater and divided the community between Siksika and then over to their schools, where I can't remember the name of the community. Colleen, we were there on both sides of the bridge that was wiped out. So it was divided, a lot where a lot of the services were, but there was also a lot of businesses on the Siksika First Nations, a lot of home-based businesses. And we got to quit thinking of businesses as just especially in the case of a disaster, as being, a physical infrastructure, some sort of a building that's been built and houses a building with a sign on it. Sometimes many of these businesses are operating out of their homes. They're, construction companies, they're consultants, they're graphic designers, they're doing that, their businesses working out of their homes. So we need to make sure, but one of the things with Siksika did is they knew there was a significant number of businesses in the community and people that were working at the home, but they had no contact information specifically related to those businesses, and realized that must be something that they work to overcome. And I think every community is the same. I can remember in the 2017 wildfires, we had a community contact us saying, do you have a list of our businesses? Because they didn't, because they'd been evacuated and they didn't have access to their computers and where all their information was stored. And it doesn't do anything if it's stored on just a computer, and it's not stored in a cloud. And if it needs to be, we need to do what we can to get this information in safe places so that, you're not dependent on somebody else to find that information for you. And again, have a CRM that's cloud-based that you're storing this information in. You don't need to change your business retention program if you have one. You need to partner with other agencies and organizations to collect this business data. It can't be just on their own. I think during COVID, one of the really good examples, Colleen, was Quesnel. Do we talk about Quesnel later?
No, we don't. No.
But Quesnel had a partnership between, a lot of different agencies, their community future, but it was led by the city, and the city of Quesnel, contacted every business owner, or a number of business owners in the community, a few hundred. They put all this information into the system, and each organization was able to see the data, run reports. and to find solutions for what these businesses were needing help with, and whether it be your the local the governance body of the community or support agencies are there to actually help those businesses overcome some of those challenges. Don't just depend on provincial and federal resources. Again, we can't always just depend on the federal government or the provincial government to provide supports in times of crisis. As how can we do things ourselves? And it doesn't always have to be the money. It's in a lot of cases some of those supports that we've talked about.
Yeah, like those education pieces that you talked about, Dale, those are something you can do at a local level. And I think sometimes at a local level, we sometimes feel maybe a little lost as to what we can do for our businesses or what we can do for our community. But I think this pandemic has really shown some of the things that you can do, and you can do so. You could do them proactively. Most of these weren't done proactively, but now that they are done, they can carry forward. But, it's things like dropping the fees for a patio so that the restaurant can have more seating because the reduction was 50%. That was at a local level. It's having a template for the COVID plan that the businesses needed. That could be done at a local level. Like there's so many things at a local level that can be done and should be done. And I think that's really important to note. And we don't go into a lot of detail because we only have an hour, but there's some great examples of what some local communities have done for their own businesses and communities.
So we'll just talk about some real quick examples, because I think we are
shoot.
What's that? Running out of time here. So in the southern Alberta floods, as we've talked a little bit about this off and on, but we were in there. We did these recovery plans for these communities, and every community's impact from the flooding was different. The difference between High River was really badly devastated, and Siksika were probably, I would say, the two worst. And then you had, Black Diamond and Turner Valley and some of those other areas that they just weren't as impacted, but they still had sort of those longer term impacts. I think the one thing that actually, just to talk about here is the media, which is why when Colleen talks about the need for a good communication strategy, is how the media can actually destroy your economy. And I mean, I don't know everything that's going on in Haida Gwaii, for an example, but I also don't know, all I can go on is what's being said on the news. But I also didn't know what was all going on in Canmore, Alberta in the 2014 flooding. But if I watched the news, the town was underwater. It was, being swept away, and there was no way anybody could go there. And well, here's a fact of Canmore. Canmore was actually closed for the highway was wiped out, just not far from the entrance to the community. And it was closed for about 3 days' time. There was a bridge on the far end of town that was washed away, and a few houses on the other side of the river from the town did get flooded. But in town itself, and where all the businesses were, and where the economy was, and where the majority of the people lived, there was no flooding. Well, that's a stand to be corrected. Actually, there was some flooding. There was one business in downtown that actually received some backup water, came up through the basement, and flooded some books that were in his basement. But that was the impact of the business. But unfortunately for the media, they went from 100% reservations for hotel bookings. They went down to less than 10% in a matter of 24 hours, just simply because people thought the town was destroyed. They can't go there. We better cancel our reservations. And I mean, they were able to build it back over time and build it back over the summer to where they were able to get a lot of people back. But it's the media, and if you're not handling or managing the communications as to what's really happening in your community, what can get told and what does get told can be completely different than reality. And that's where we need to be on top of that. The BC wildfires 2017, 2018. In 2017, we established a hotline for businesses that phone in looking for assistance. We provided a lot of different assistance to communities and businesses around the province. We had an incredible team of volunteers from different community futures organizations, Community Futures Sun Country and Community Futures out of Quesnel and Prince George and 100 Mile. Everybody was pulling together to make sure that, you know, our businesses, that those businesses that would call in to the hotline would, and then what happened is the information got put into our system, and then we were able to send the local governments or the Indigenous government the reports immediately that we were getting from their businesses so that they knew what the impacts were. And I can remember the Williams Lake Indian Band, we were sending reports to them on a regular basis with comments that we were receiving that, you know, from businesses, and then of course putting those businesses in touch with people that could help mentor them through the challenges that they were being impacted with. Virgin Islands, Colleen, you want to briefly talk about that?
Yeah, really briefly. It was part of the International Council of Economic Developer Council. Anyway, Washington, D.C. and they have their own economic disaster recovery program there. And we were sent to the Virgin Islands after the hurricanes that they had there. They experienced two within a couple of months or 6 months of each other. And we were there to talk to the businesses just to see whether the programs that were made available were, you know, did something, you know, were they useful or were they used? Did the businesses even know about them? And it was a really interesting experience. I would say, you know, one of the challenges that we found when we got there was the organization, the Economic Development Organization that we were in contact with locally and who had scheduled us to meet with the businesses there, used their clientele, right? Like used their client base, the people that they had given loans to and such. And so we knew after, you know, a couple of days, we really weren't getting the full picture by just having a select group of businesses that we met with. So we were able to get other input. And once we started kind of branching out from those client type businesses, we were starting to get a different story. So it was an interesting experience for sure about how the programs were working or didn't work. And it was a real mixed bag at the end of the day.
And this was really as well where we saw a lot of the examples of the need for the reentry programs and the need to make sure that you had a coordinated approach for getting people back into the neighborhoods or into the areas. And you know, they did a good job of evacuating people, but again, what they did was, you know, they didn't have a plan in place on how they'd manage the reentry, and they opened the doors and said, okay, everybody, you know, go back in. And unfortunately, if they'd have allowed the businesses to get in first to secure their properties, you know, the impacts that some of those businesses would have felt wouldn't have been as dramatic. I can remember that one gentleman we were talking to with a furniture store, Colleen, and him and his son were there, and they, you know, they had to sleep on the property at nighttime. The looters were the first ones through the gate, and they got there, and the looters were driving away with furniture, and the police were right there on the corner just watching them go, and because there was no way to manage everything, it was just a schmozzle, and that's where it's so important to have a real solid reentry plan in place that manages that. And I mean, I think back to the 2017 wildfires too, and when you let people back into the community, and the first thing that should happen is if you don't have your contact list for your businesses, it's pretty hard to communicate with them. But it's important to have your restaurants, your gas stations, grocery stores, whatever, back into the community you know, before the general public gets back in, so that when people get back into the community themselves, and if you open the doors at the same time, and your businesses and residents go into the community at the same time, and they want to go out for coffee and there's no coffee because the restaurants are, you know, closed because they have no supplies, or the grocery stores, everything's rotten and they have to be thrown away, or the gas stations have no gas because the tanks got emptied by the people evacuating the communities. I mean, these are things that could be managed better if we had reentry plans when we head out of the community.
Yeah, and that's just, as we said, part of that pre-planning, right? Having that disaster plan, economic recovery plan in place, having that business reentry program in place, which the Virgin Islands certainly do now. One thing good that they did do, just touching quickly, is the supplier list that they had, so pre-qualified suppliers which is really important to do for a community as well. So that, you know, when recovery starts to happen, that there's a suppliers list of people who are dependable, who aren't going to rip you off, who are, you know, perhaps, you know, bondable, insured, whatever it is, right? But is a reliable list for businesses and individuals, residents, whatever, to call upon, so that, you know, they're not getting ripped off, right? And unfortunately, that happens too often in a disaster as well.
Yeah, and we've seen that. We've seen that in you know, in Alberta as well, Colleen, where,
Yeah.
you know, drywallers or electricians would come in and say, hey, I can do your work, and only to find out that they weren't certified, they weren't licensed, they didn't even have business licenses. And then what happens is, of course, insurance companies won't cover anything, or they can't get permits or whatever. So it's, you know, it's just so important to have that. And maybe just we'll close off here, Colleen, with Grand Forks, because we are at our time limit. But with Grand Forks, we were in there. We went in a few weeks after the flooding, or it was about a month, I guess, after the flooding, for a first visit with a team. We sent a team of EDOs in, and this was working with the province and the local government and Community Futures to go in and do a short-term recovery plan. So what are some of those immediate first steps that the community could be taking to recover from the disaster? And then we went back in and we did a complete assessment of the businesses that were impacted by the flooding to determine sort of what is that financial impact, the loss of jobs, the loss of sales, the loss of, you know, profits, etc., what their, you know, repair bills would be, and got that information to government to be able to help them make decisions on levels of support, which, you know, worked and didn't work, I guess you could say. And then we went back in, you know, 3 months later and did a long-term strategy for them to recover from the disaster. So I don't know, Colleen, is there any point in talking about, I think,
No, we're a couple of minutes over already.
Flon, we talked about, and then of course COVID, and we've talked a bit about COVID as we've gone through.
Yeah.
So thanks very much. I think it's important that you realize that communities really are not prepared, and I suspect, you know, maybe even your communities, and I don't want to label anybody, but I mean, maybe even your communities are not ready. And I would encourage you to look at your emergency management plans, and if it does not have a recovery phase in it that mentions the words economy or economic or business, have it amended, have it changed, make those changes necessary to make sure that you're addressing that whole economic picture of the disaster that it's going to take there. How are your communities going to recover from being closed from COVID? I think it's a fair question. What are the specific strategies that you can be putting in place right now? And if that means, you know, you contract with somebody or whatever to help you put together that bit of a plan, you know, I think it's important that your community is looking at how do we get people back to our communities and to, you know, the tourists, or as that video showed, you know, how do we get those people back to make sure that our residents, our citizens, our members are actually recovering from an economic standpoint. We're happy to talk to you about that if it's needed. And but the process is definitely easier if you're prepared. So I would encourage you to look at what your things are and see how you can help your community better prepare.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Dale, that plan, pre-plan, please pre-plan. And the other thing, you know, what we should add to that list, just thinking about it, is a business retention plan. If you don't have a business retention plan in place, you need to. If COVID does not teach you anything about engaging with your businesses, I don't know what will. So I would say a key component to a successful recovery is a strong, active business retention and expansion program.
Colleen, is there a minimum number of businesses a community needs to be able to, or to where it should have a retention plan, or a business retention or a business engagement?
No, I would say if you're a small community and you have 2 businesses, then talk to those 2 businesses, right? So no, it doesn't matter how many businesses, but if you're a large community, maybe you have 10,000 businesses, you're not going to be able to talk to 10,000 businesses. I mean, we know that, right? But maybe you can talk to 2 businesses or 3 businesses a month, right? There's no minimum, just start to do it. It's
Yeah.
so important to start to do it.
And I think it's also like, and if you are a smaller community and you say, oh, I only have 2 businesses, and maybe it's a gas station and a little coffee shop or something, think about how many businesses are actually operating out of their homes. Those are businesses as well. Maybe they're not a licensed business with you or whatever, but they are a business in your community that, and they're depending on the revenue from that business. And if they lose that opportunity to make revenue, you know, maybe they're an artisan, maybe they're an artist, maybe they're you know, creating, growing food to sell in a market, maybe they're whatever. How do we work with those businesses? Let's better engage with them to make sure that we know how we can work with them when the time comes.
Yeah.
So Lana, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Dale and Colleen, for this informative presentation. Everybody else, thank you so much for joining us, and I will send a PowerPoint presentation to everybody a little bit later today. And if you do have any questions, I know we ran out of time a bit, so just email the questions to me, or maybe Dale's presentation will have Dale's and Colleen's email addresses or contact information, so feel free to contact either of us, and we'll answer those questions. So thank you so much once again. Have a great afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your summer, and we'll be doing some more webinars in the future. So just keep an eye on our communications, and yeah, keep on joining us.
Great. Thank you. Take care. Bye now, everybody.
Okay. Bye-bye.